Thanks for joining me on episode 914 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
Hi, I'm Dan Miller from 48days.com. I challenge you to invest in yourself, invest in others, develop your influence, and impact the world by using your time, your talent, and your treasures to live out your calling. Having the ability to find the work you love is key. And one way to be inspired to do that is to listen to this, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast with my friend, Scott Mader.
And the truth is, this works for almost any change. This works for almost any improvement. If you're trying to work on your health situation, you've got to go through the same process. If you're trying to work on your money situation, you've got to go through the same process. If you want to work on maybe improving yourself in terms of studies or learning, you've got to go through the same process. But here's the kicker. Here's the trick. Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world. In today's episode about impacting the world through stewarding your talent, I talk with you about the 3 stages of change that I use with clients in coaching. I also share why this framework works for almost any change, and I share why too often we try to do these things wildly out of order. You've heard me talk about developing your talent, and one of the best ways to do that is through books. But if you're like most people today, it's hard to find the time to read. And that's why today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Go to inspiredstewardship.com/audible to sign up, and you can get a 30-day free trial. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from, and you can pick one and listen your way to developing your talents via Audible. That's inspiredstewardship.com/audible to get your free trial and listen to great books the same way you're listening to this podcast. As I was talking with Roger on Monday, it made me reflect on how one of the things that I've talked about a little bit before, but I thought I would dive a little deeper into it today, which is the stages that I use when I'm working with clients on how they move through the process of coaching. And the truth is, there's a lot of different ways you can frame coaching, and I'm not going to say that one is right and the rest are wrong, but for me, this 3-stage idea makes a lot of sense, and I've discovered that I can apply this same lens to a lot of things that aren't just working with clients in coaching. Those 3 stages are refocus, gain control, and set a plan. So we talk a little bit about what they are, and then talk a little bit about how oftentimes we use these wrong. See, refocus is about stopping and taking a look at where you are, doing an honest assessment of what's going on. It's about taking a stock of what's gone right, maybe what's gone wrong. What are some of the things that you should be doing differently? It's a Dr. Phil moment. How's this working for you? It's the moment that you've got to be brutally honest with yourself. You've got to really take stock of where you stand. You've got to not just look at all of the good stuff and think about the best case scenario, but you've also got to look at what happens if it doesn't work. What happens if something goes wrong? But you don't want to look at just what happens if it goes wrong either. You also want to think about hopeful things. It's about really diving in deep and asking those powerful questions about change, about what's going on and what's happening. It's one of the reasons that working with a coach or an accountability partner is often very useful in this stage, because we tend to either look at things as if everything is going wrong, or we look at things as if everything is going right. And the truth is, neither one of those extremes is usually what's really going on in the situation. We tend to be very up, down, pro, con, black and white in our thinking, but the reality is there's often shades of gray. The second stage, gain control. This is about stepping back, and now that you've done that assessment, now that you've looked at the reality that you're operating from, now that you've been brutally honest with yourself and said, this is where I stand, it's about stopping and figuring out what's on fire, what's maybe going so wrong that we really need to intervene quickly, what's maybe doing okay that we can leave it alone for a while. What are the areas that I need to focus on first or second or third to improve this situation? It's about actually putting together steps and an action plan that you can do in the next stage. Gain control is about stopping the bleeding. If something's going wrong, it's about making it where it's not going quite so wrong. It's about making improvements to the situation. And oftentimes these improvements are small improvements at first, but they begin to compound over time. So maybe it's about simply not going into debt any further than you are today. It's not yet about paying off the debt. It's just about stopping the continuous cycle of going into debt. That would be an example of that kind of gain control step. Of course, how you do that, again, involves a lot of work, involves a lot of questioning, involves a lot of work from the refocus stage. And again, this is where working with a coach or an accountability partner, somebody who has experience and who's seen a lot of different things, can often jumpstart that process because they've got some ideas that maybe you don't have. And then from there, you naturally begin to set a plan. You begin to look at not just the immediate, not just what do we need to do to stop the bleeding? What do we need to do to deal with the emergency that we're dealing with today? But you begin to look beyond that and say, what's the path forward? What's the path that's going to make tomorrow a little better than today? What's the path that's going to make next year even better than that? What's the path that's going to get us completely out of debt? Or what's the path that's going to get us beyond that? And now that we have achieved debt freedom, what are we going to do next? What's the bigger reason for this? What's the true long-term and short-term game plan? The truth is, what's interesting is then you'll begin to execute on that plan. And as you do, you'll discover the need to refocus again. You'll circle back to the beginning because the truth is you'll uncover new situations, new issues, new problems, new challenges, and new successes and new wins as well. And those will change the situation because it's dynamic. And so it's really a loop rather than a path. Refocus, gain control, set a plan, refocus again, gain control, set a plan, refocus again, gain control, set a plan. And the truth is this works for almost any change. This works for almost any improvement. If you're trying to work on your health situation, you've got to go through the same process. If you're trying to work on your money situation, you've got to go through the same process. If you want to work on maybe improving yourself in terms of studies or learning, you've got to go through the same process. But here's the kicker. Here's the trick. Even though I've laid this out, there's somebody that automatically, every single time you do this, you want to go straight to setting a plan. You don't want to stop and do the refocus and gain control steps. You want to just say, what does the plan say? What are the 7 steps that I need to follow so that I can get where I want to go? And I'll just go execute on these steps. But without doing the work of refocusing and gaining control, usually those steps don't stick. You either begin to move forward and then slip backwards, or you move forward, even get to the end goal, but because you haven't really been doing that loop of refocus, gain control, and set a plan, you end up right back where you started from a few years later. I know so many people that have set really big goals for themselves, whether that's a health change, whether that's a money change, and then have slipped back to right back into their old bad habits because they don't really work, refocus, gain control, and set a plan, and therefore they never achieve lasting and sustainable change. That's why these loops, this process, this thought process about change really works. Thanks for listening. Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you like this episode on the stewardship of talent, you can go over to inspiredstewardship.com/talent and sign up for our 5-week series on the stewardship of talent. Or if you're in the U.S., you can text 44222 talent tips. That's talent tips to 44222 and get those tips. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.